Welcome to stage 11. We're now halfway through the stages and we've actually made a lot of the parts that are needed in the later stages, so they should be a little bit faster. Now this stage appears very simple, there's only one part to add, but actually we're going to have a look at some troubleshooting and some things that can go wrong when you're working with modular parts like Lego. Before we start, make sure you've got the main assembly open and make sure you've got that 4-beam extension that we just made open as well. Let's insert that part now, so let's go to Assembly, Insert Components, and we'll choose that 4-beam with extension and we'll put it in a position like this. Now we know it attaches in this place, so I'm going to choose a circular face here on the axle and also inside that hole on the 4-beam, and I'm going to make those concentric and I'm going to lock the rotation. And I'm also just going to bring the part into the correct distance by choosing the inside face here and the outer face here and making those coincident. So at first glance it looks like our stage is completed. But actually, if we look more closely, we've got some problems. The parts from the different stages don't quite fit together here. And if we look from the side, it's really obvious. This axle and this axle hole don't line up. Now, some of this might be due to the flexibility of Lego. When you make this in real life, the parts are going to move around a little bit and maybe bend slightly, and that will allow these small changes to fit together. It might also be due to small differences in measurement. For example, one part could maybe be measured 0.05 millimeters too large, and then over a number of parts that small difference will add up. But if we look at the side of our assembly here, we can see something obviously isn't quite right. It's not just a small difference there. So let's do a little bit of troubleshooting. Let's get the measure tool from the Evaluate tab and start to try and see what the problem is. So we know that the nominal or the usual size between sets of holes should be 8 millimeters. That's a pretty standard measurement throughout Lego. And just looking at our assembly, it looks like all of this bit on the left is a little bit too far back, too far to the left as we're looking at it now. So if we try measuring, say, from here to here, it's coming up at the bottom as 16.97 millimeters. Now, if we're expecting 8 millimeters between holes, then we'd expect that to be a multiple of 8. So it should be 16, not 16.9. So maybe we've got some kind of problem with this corner beam part with that diagonal section. If we made that shorter, it would bring everything forward and down a bit, and that seems like it would solve a lot of our problems. So let's open that corner beam part and let's have a look at it more closely. Click on the part and press Open Part, and then when we're in the part, let's edit that first sketch, the beam sketch. Now the problem is, when we first made this part, I was a little bit lazy. I didn't measure everything. I assumed that because the distance between these holes along the bottom is 8, then it would be the same 8 millimeters between these holes going up the diagonal here. But if we think about this logically, because of the angle, that won't work properly. We want the distance between two sets of rows to be a multiple of 8, and we also want the distance between two sets of columns to be a multiple of 8. And if I add in some dimensions, we can see that we're off there. It's saying 16.9 when it should be 16 exactly. So this diagonal corner section must be too long. And actually, if I go back to my Lego part and I measure it properly with the calipers, it is smaller than 8 millimeters. So I can now delete that dimension and I can fix it. So we should have 16 between these two holes. And then because we've got a 45-degree angle there, it should also be 16 between these two sets of holes. And now if we measure this, we can see that's actually a little bit less. We had that down as 8. It's actually more like 6.6. So that's where our problem lies. So let's make that change and then exit the sketch. And this is the beauty of SolidWorks. You can go back to any stage in your model and you can make changes, and then that can drag through to your final finished assembly. You don't have to start everything again from scratch. So now let's go back to our assembly and see how that affects things. Your assembly should update automatically. If it doesn't, you can rebuild by pressing Ctrl B or pressing Rebuild up here. So if we zoom in a bit, we can see we've no longer got a clash on the gear that we had before. And also it looks like the axle and the axle hole are lined up left-right as we're looking at it, but they're still a bit off up-down. So we're getting closer to the correct solution, but we've still got a bit of a problem. So let's get the measure tool and we'll see where we're still going wrong. And let's say measure between these two axles here. So the distance here should be 8.0 to fit in with that standard 8 millimeter spacing, but it's actually coming out as 7.6. And the reason is this axle with a bore part is actually sitting too far down in that 10 subassembly that we made in the last video. Let's open that subassembly and fix this. So I'm just going to click on one of the parts so I can see where the subassembly is in the parts tree, and then I'm going to click on stage 10 and press Open Subassembly. So back in our subassembly, So the vertical distance between this circle and this circle should be 8 millimeters. If we get the measure tool, we can see that's 7.6. So we need to move that section up 0.4. To do this, I'm going to expand the mates. I'm going to delete that coincident mate that we've already added. You could also just edit it and change it to a distance mate. If you hover over the mates, their surfaces should be highlighted, so you should be able to find the correct one. Now, if we try to select the two circular faces and make those a certain distance apart, 8 millimeters, then you'll find that we can't really do this because the distance mate is trying to set the shortest distance between them, which will be a diagonal line. We actually just want a vertical line. So if we can't add a mate directly, instead we can use the planes. Let's find the plane that goes down the middle of the axle with bore part, and also find the plane that goes down the middle of the cross block 3 long part. And then we can just add a distance mate that's 8 millimeters there. So we do have a small gap in between those two parts now, but we know that the axles are at the correct spacing. So now let's save that subassembly. Let's use Control Tab to go back to the main assembly and see how we're looking. Right, we can now see from the side that the axles are lined up correctly. However, we've still got one final issue. This axle part with the center bore seems like it's slightly too wide because it's making this 2 beam with axle part clash with that latest 4 beam with extension part that we added. Let's open that axle with bore part and have a closer look at it. Now if I double click on that middle feature, we can see the width of it is 9.6. And actually it's another case of me being lazy. I didn't measure this properly. It should actually be smaller for this one. It should only be 7.4, which is that standard width of the block. So you should be able to double click on that 9.6 and then change it to 7.4. If you can't do it directly there in the graphics area, you can also edit that middle feature and just change the width of the midplane to 7.4. And then the diameter of the actual circle should also be a bit bigger. So if you double click on that, it should be 7.4 as well, not 5.9. So it should look more like this. Now let's save that part and go back to the main assembly and see how it looks. And yes, now we can see everything lines up correctly. We do have a small gap in there. That's okay. That's just for the tolerance between the parts, maybe where they've been measured slightly differently to each other, or maybe just to allow them to fit together properly without being too tight. So this stage is now done. I just wanted to show some examples of, even when you're making parts that you think you know the dimensions of, always be careful and maybe double check your dimensions as you go. In the next section, we'll go on to stage 12, which only involves 2 new parts, and they're both pretty simple.